As you think, so shall you become. These are the words we've all heard from Bruce Lee, but behind them lies a truth far deeper than most dare to uncover. There exists a technique, unspoken, unnamed, and hidden in the shadows of his practice, not forbidden by law, but by the limitations of ordinary minds. This was not a martial technique of fist or foot, but of psyche. Bruce Lee, like all those who walk the path of true mastery, did not fear his opponents. He feared himself, or more precisely, what lay hidden within himself. And so he descended, into the unconscious, into the shadow, the repressed fears, the ancient instincts, the parts of himself that society said to forget. This mental technique was a confrontation, a dialogue with that inner shadow. A discipline where he stood not in front of a mirror, but in front of his inner abyss. You see, Lee did not only train his body, he practiced something akin to active imagination, a process of allowing images, symbols, and sensations to arise from the depths of the unconscious. In stillness, he saw movement. In silence, he heard instruction. He would visualize a fight, not to prepare, but to become the fight. Not to defeat the opponent, but to understand what part of himself the opponent represented. This technique, forbidden not because it is dangerous, but because it is transformational, allowed him to transmute raw emotion into pure motion. Rage became rhythm. Fear became fluidity. Doubt became adaptability. He became, in his own words, like water, not by mimicry, but by psychological alchemy. And then the ego began to dissolve. The self that needed to prove, to dominate, to control, was slowly shed. What emerged was a deeper self, spontaneous, instinctive, whole. This was not performance. It was presence. He often wrote his dreams, not as superstition, but as sacred maps, symbols that emerged from within him. Each punch he threw was guided not by muscle memory, but by unconscious intelligence awakened in these dreams. His journey was not just physical. It was mythic. Like the ancient warrior heroes of legend, he descended into himself, faced his inner dragons, and returned changed. This is what few know. The forbidden technique was not some ancient martial art. It was the art of becoming whole. It was individuation, the integration of all that he was, both light and dark, conscious and unconscious. In truth, this technique is forbidden only because it demands something rare, courage. Not the courage to fight another, but the courage to fight oneself. And Bruce Lee, he won that battle, not with victory, but with transformation. Thank you. When we imagine Bruce Lee, we often see the perfectly chiseled body, the lightning-fast strikes, and the confidence of a man who seemed invincible. But to understand what truly made him exceptional, we must look not at the man in the mirror, but at the one behind it, the hidden self, the shadow. Every human being carries within them a shadow, the suppressed parts of the psyche that we are taught to ignore, deny, or repress. It is the repository of all that we fear, dislike, or cannot accept about ourselves, and yet paradoxically, it is also the source of tremendous energy, creativity, and authenticity. The shadow is not merely darkness, it is the unlived life. Bruce Lee, unlike most, did not flee from his shadow. He turned toward it, he stared into it, and over time he learned to speak its language. This is the forbidden path, to see one's flaws not as obstacles, but as teachers. In his journals, in his reflections, and in the solitude of his training, Bruce was not simply perfecting technique. He was confronting himself. Every jab, every sidekick, every sudden burst of motion was not just a rehearsal of the body, but a symbolic ritual, a battle with the parts of his psyche that wanted to sabotage him, control him, diminish him. He once wrote, "The enemy within must be vanquished before the enemy outside can be conquered." This was no poetic abstraction. It was a psychological truth he lived daily. Lee's greatest opponent was never the man standing before him in the ring. It was the part of himself that whispered, "You are not enough." The voice of fear, the voice of doubt, the voice of inherited cultural expectations and internalized limitation. And yet, instead of silencing this voice, he listened. He invited it into the dojo of his mind. There, he engaged in a different kind of sparring, not of punches and blocks, but of inquiry, recognition, and transformation. This is the essence of shadow work, not the eradication of darkness, but its integration. The warrior who integrates his shadow becomes more than disciplined, he becomes whole. His actions are no longer reactive but rooted. He does not simply perform, he embodies. Bruce Lee did not arrive at this understanding by accident. He lived between two worlds, East and West, body and mind, tradition and revolution. This duality forced him to confront a fragmented sense of identity. In such fragmentation, many lose themselves. But Li used this fragmentation as fuel, as the doorway into a deeper exploration of what it means to be human. He came to realize that true mastery is not about dominance or victory, but about integration. To strike cleanly, one must be internally clear. To move without hesitation, one must be free of inner conflict. The body responds to the mind, but the mind is haunted by the parts it refuses to face. Bruce Lee faced them. He faced them. He faced his rage, his impatience, his self-doubt, his cultural dislocation. These were not enemies. They were untrained aspects of himself. Through training, meditation, and reflection, he began to reclaim them. He took back the parts of his psyche that had been exiled. And in doing so, he evolved. He was no longer merely fighting opponents. He was refining the self. He became a vessel for something larger than ego, an embodiment of inner harmony forged in fire. This secret mental discipline, hidden beneath sweat and steel, was nothing less than a sacred ritual, the meeting of the conscious mind with the unconscious depths, the integration of light and shadow. So, the birth of the inner warrior. There is a kind of thinking that does not begin with logic, but with images. It is not concerned with answers, but with meaning. It is a discipline rarely taught, because it cannot be standardized, measured, or contained. Yet this was the very technique Bruce Lee practiced in silence, a method not of physical repetition, but of inner vision. He would not have called it active imagination, yet that is what it was in its purest form, a conscious dialogue with the unconscious. In moments of stillness, before training, after exertion, or alone in the early hours, Bruce Lee entered a state of deep mental visualization. But this was not goal-oriented daydreaming. He was not simply imagining a perfect kick or rehearsing a sequence of movements. What he was doing went far deeper. He was stepping into a symbolic realm, a space between thought and dream, where intuition speaks and movement and emotion is not suppressed but studied. This state allowed him to interact with inner figures, archetypes, that represented forces within himself. The teacher, the warrior, the doubter, the critic, the child, these were not abstract concepts, but active presences within the internal theater of his imagination. In this private ritual, Bruce did not control the narrative. He allowed the narrative to unfold. He watched, listened, responded, as though engaging in conversation with something beyond the narrow confines of the ego. Many who train in martial arts rely solely on the repetition of the visible. Bruce Lee understood the limits of that path. Technique without internal clarity becomes hollow. Strength without psychological grounding becomes reckless. So he turned inward, not to escape, but to encounter. Through his practice of visualization, he developed not only technical precision, but psychic sensitivity. He began to feel the flow of energy between intention and execution, between thought and action. This was no longer the domain of reflexes alone. It was the cultivation of a higher awareness, a kind of psychophysical intelligence that bridged the conscious and unconscious mind. In this state of disciplined imagination, movements would reveal themselves not as commands from the will, but as expressions of deeper impulses. The body became a conduit, not a machine. Sometimes he would envision himself fighting an opponent who was faster, stronger, more brutal, a shadow figure. At other times he imagined losing, crumbling, failing. These were not nightmares, they were exercises in psychological fortification. He was preparing not just to fight, but to transform. In the West, visualization is often treated as a tool to manifest success, to picture a goal and strive toward it. But what Bruce Lee practiced was far older, more nuanced, and more dangerous. It was a process of meeting unknown parts of himself, not to bend them to his will, but to understand what they demanded from him. And in return, they gave him insight, energy, and flexibility beyond the reach of ordinary discipline. This internal work demanded just as much rigor as his physical training. He had to face images he did not summon, thoughts he could not explain, emotions that resisted control. But in that, he refined his intuition, the deepest kind of knowing, born not from intellect, but from integration. His movement in combat was not a reaction. It was a revelation, a sudden emergence of meaning from the depths of the self. Through this hidden method, he cultivated not just awareness, but an intimate relationship with the unseen architecture of his psyche. He entered an imaginal space where symbols became mentors, fear became dialogue, and instinct became prophecy. To the outside observer, Bruce Lee's movements appeared effortless, fluid, instinctive, unburdened by hesitation or tension. But beneath this visible grace was a crucible of internal pressure, a quiet furnace where fear, frustration, and inner conflict were not denied, but transmuted. This was his true art, not only the mastery of form, but the transformation of emotional lead into psychic gold. What he practiced in secret was a kind of mental alchemy. Alchemy, misunderstood for centuries as the literal turning of metal into treasure, was never merely about material change. Its symbols speak to a deeper transformation, an evolution of the soul. At the heart of alchemy is the belief that everything impure contains the seed of its own perfection. Bruce Lee did not eliminate fear. He refined it. He did not suppress anger. He shaped it into precision. Every emotion that arose, anxiety, doubt, even rage, was treated not as an enemy to conquer, but as a raw element to be reworked. He often spoke of being like water, adaptable, formless, receptive. Yet within that metaphor lies the implication that something must first be melted down. The solid self, the rigid ego, the fixed identity, the defensive posture had to dissolve. And that dissolution began not in the body, but in the psyche. He allowed fear to surface. He did not run from it. He studied its nature, its rhythm, its effect on breath, timing, and thought. Fear became a teacher. Rather than trying to control fear, he entered into relationship with it. He explored how it moved within him, how it whispered sabotage, how it tightened muscles before a strike, how it narrowed the field of awareness. And then he began to experiment. What happened if he invited the fear in, not as a saboteur, but as a kind of energy? What if fear was not weakness, but a signal, an invitation to become more awake? This shift was not merely philosophical. It was physiological, neurological, spiritual. He trained his nervous system to stay relaxed under pressure, not by ignoring threat, but by confronting it in the sanctuary of his own mind. He used visualization, breath, and deep concentration to simulate the inner conditions of chaos. Within these internal storms, he remained present. Over time, the patterns of reactivity dissolved. A new rhythm emerged, one not based in resistance, but in attunement. This was flow, not a mystical trance, but a trained capacity to remain completely immersed, fully responsive, and entirely unconstrained. Flow is not the absence of obstacles. It is the refined movement of consciousness through them. Bruce Lee's flow was not gifted. It was forged. The forge was his willingness to face the full range of emotion without flinching. In combat, hesitation is fatal, not because of delay, but because of disconnection. A single thought of self-preservation can interrupt the totality of engagement. Bruce Lee conditioned his mind to trust its own unfolding. He did not rely on strategy alone. He relied on a cultivated spontaneity, born of deep internal work. When fear arose, he did not retreat. He shifted, adapted, absorbed, transformed. This was the silent technique, never taught, never spoken of in dojos or films, the art of turning inner friction into psychic fuel. He had trained not only his fists, but the fire within. This fire, when unrefined, burns indiscriminately. But when tended with awareness, it illuminates. It gives life, power, and speed. And perhaps most importantly, it creates stillness in the center of motion. Through this discipline, Bruce Lee discovered that fear, when transfigured, becomes clarity. That doubt, when confronted, becomes momentum. That tension, when embraced, becomes fluidity. He no longer sought to master others, but to master his inner atmosphere. His power came not from domination, but from the radical act of internal transmutation. At the center of every struggle for mastery lies a silent and invisible opponent. The ego. Not the ego in its ordinary sense of confidence or pride, but the constructed identity that each person unconsciously builds to navigate the world. This false self is armor and mask, defense and delusion. Bruce Lee, in his private discipline, did not merely train to become stronger, faster, or more skillful. He trained to dismantle the illusion of who he thought he was. The ego demands control. It seeks certainty, praise, recognition, and superiority. It defines itself by opposition. I am this, not that. I win, therefore I am worthy. But beneath these claims lies fear, the fear of dissolution, of failure, of being no one. Bruce Lee understood that the path to true fluidity in both martial art and life required a dangerous undertaking. To dissolve this false self, to die to the ego and be reborn in presence. This process did not happen in a single moment, but through repeated inner deaths, small sacrifices of image, control, and the need to be right. He would stand in front of a mirror, not to admire himself, but to observe the layers. Who is watching? Who is performing? Who is performing? What part of me is reacting to fear of judgment? He observed these layers with the discipline of a meditator, stripping them away like an alchemist reducing matter to its essence. When he said, to become, one must first be empty, he was not speaking of physical posture, but of inner posture. Emptiness in this context was not a lack, but a receptivity, the absence of the rigid self, the surrender of the constructed personality that wants to be admired or remembered. To be truly empty meant to be without resistance, to move not from thought, but from awareness itself. In combat, the ego is a liability. It tightens the muscles, overthinks, hesitates, needs to win. The true warrior operates from a different place, from a state of detachment, not from indifference, but from non-attachment. Bruce Lee cultivated this state through silence, through meditation, through confrontation with the inner voices that scream for control. He learned to watch them, not obey them, and in that watching, their power diminished. This dissolution of ego also meant shedding the cultural masks he had inherited, the expectations of being Chinese in a Western world, the pressure to conform to images of masculinity, the need to prove his worth through perfection. He began to recognize these scripts not as truth but as conditioning. In recognizing them, he loosened their grip. In loosening their grip, he found movement that was no longer bound by narrative. To fight without ego is to engage without identity. There is no need to defend, only energy responding to energy. This is where his art ceased to be performance and became pure presence. Every block, every strike, every breath emerged from the moment itself, not from the mind's rehearsal or the ego's agenda. It was a kind of emptiness filled with clarity, a silence that spoke through movement. The deeper he went into this inner territory, the more he realized that technique, style, and even knowledge could become traps. If clung to too tightly, they became ego extensions, badges of status rather than expressions of truth. This realization led him to abandon fixed forms, to famously declare that a style is a crystallization. It is not an ever-expanding process. He was not rejecting knowledge, but warning against identification. When one becomes attached to method, one becomes blind to the moment. What he sought instead was freedom, not political, not social, but existential. The freedom to act without interference from the inner narrator. The freedom to move without needing to prove. This was the place beyond ego, where authenticity was no longer performed, but embodied in the hidden layers of Bruce Lee's personal journals and writings. There exists a curious pattern. Scattered between notes on training regimens and philosophical reflections are sketches, cryptic phrases, and fragments of dreams. They are rarely explained, never systematically organized, and yet they point to something crucial. A deep engagement with the symbolic language of the unconscious. Modern culture tends to discard dreams as meaningless echoes, neurological static with no bearing on waking life. But Bruce Lee, influenced by both Eastern mysticism and Western depth thought, approached dreams as messages, veiled communications from a part of the psyche more ancient and instinctive than the rational mind. To him, dreams were not hallucinations but hieroglyphs, encoded truths waiting to be interpreted. The unconscious does not speak in words or logic. It speaks in images, in metaphors, in movements that feel both foreign and deeply familiar. Bruce understood this intuitively. Just as martial arts rely on the body's non-verbal intelligence, dream work required the same openness, the willingness to feel before understanding, to observe without immediately translating. Dreams, like combat, unfold from a deeper intelligence than thought. Within his dreams, Bruce would sometimes encounter animals, shadows, strange figures, or scenarios in which he was defeated, disarmed, or overwhelmed. These were not fears to be dismissed, but symbolic dramatizations of his inner landscape. A recurring image might represent a pattern he hadn't yet seen in his waking life, a tendency toward control, an unresolved wound, or an unlived aspect of his potential. In this way, each dream became a mirror, showing not the self he wanted to be, but the self he was becoming. He engaged with these symbols not academically, but creatively, sketching them, reflecting on them, sometimes moving with their energy in his physical practice. If a dream presented him with a powerful adversary, he did not interpret it as an omen, but as an invitation to study that adversary's qualities within himself. Was the opponent a symbol of internal resistance, an embodiment of his own aggression, a guardian at the threshold of transformation? These symbols, when carried into the waking world, were not left as static ideas. They became kinetic. He would incorporate the feeling of the dream into his training of the dream into his training. A movement seen in a dream might be practiced in waking life. A sensation experienced in sleep might be explored through breath or stillness. In this way, the boundary between conscious and unconscious began to dissolve, allowing his physical practice to become not just disciplined, but visionary. The unconscious is not limited by the logic of daylight. It offers paradoxes, contradictions, and insights that challenge the ego's sense of control. Bruce Lee invited this disruption because he knew it revealed something essential, the psyche's demand to grow beyond the confines of habit and persona. Symbols became his guides. Not in a mystical or superstitious sense, but in the most practical one. They brought into light what rational thought had overlooked. He understood, too, that the symbols were not universal in the simplistic sense. They were his symbols. They belonged to his inner cosmology, shaped by his upbringing, his cultural hybridity, his struggles between tradition and innovation. He did not seek external validation for these images. He trusted them. In doing so, he trusted himself, not the self that performed or proved, but the self that watched, listened, and integrated. The unconscious is not a passive storehouse of memories. It is an active shaping force, alive with mythic patterns and archetypal energies. Bruce Lee approached it not as a domain to be conquered, but as a dimension to be entered. His dreams were not distractions from his path. They were the path, layered with insights, warnings, challenges, and revelations that his waking mind could not yet comprehend beneath the surface of Bruce Lee's relentless pursuit of physical mastery, philosophical clarity, and creative expression was a deeper, more solitary journey, a process that transcended style, discipline, and identity. It was the journey of individuation. The long and often painful unfolding of the true self from the fractured layers of persona, ego, and inherited expectation. Bruce Lee was not merely becoming a fighter, an actor, or a thinker. He was becoming himself. Individuation is not improvement. It is not refinement. It is not the acquisition of new traits or techniques. It is a stripping away, a shedding of all that is not essential, not authentic, not rooted in the inner core of being. Bruce Lee moved through this process like a modern mythic figure, not with the safety of a clearly marked path, but with the risk of constant self-confrontation. The warrior he forged was not born of certainty, but of conflict, inner conflict. His life presented him with the paradoxes that drive the individuation process. He was both insider and outsider, revered in the East, scrutinized in the West. He was both artist and athlete, thinker and doer, disciplined and rebellious. These contradictions were not distractions from his path. They were the path. Each polarity forced him to reconcile the opposites within himself, to navigate the tension between form and freedom, tradition and innovation, strength and sensitivity. This tension is the crucible of individuation. One cannot become whole by choosing one side of the self over the other. The true self is born in the space between, in the space where inner opposites collide, dissolve, and reconfigure. Bruce did not try to resolve these opposites by eliminating one in favor of the other. He allowed them to coexist, to inform one another, to shape a psyche that was no longer split. Every stage of his evolution, from classical Wing Chun to Jeet Kune Do, from Hollywood roles to private philosophical writings, marked not just an external transformation, but a psychic milestone. He was discarding not only techniques that no longer served him, but identities that had grown too small. He was not content to be a reflection of someone else's ideal, the dutiful student, the perfect martial artist, the Asian archetype in a Western film. He broke these molds not for rebellion's sake, but because his inner voice demanded truth over conformity. This inner voice, the voice of the self in its deepest sense, became louder as he matured. It was not always comforting. It did not flatter. It required sacrifice, solitude, and the courage to stand alone. While others sought to imitate his moves, he was moving into territories few could follow. A domain where the art was no longer something he practiced, but something he was. The warrior was not a role he played, was a symbol of his integration. And in that integration, the boundaries between physical and psychological practice blurred. Training became a metaphor for inner work. The refinement of movement mirrored the refinement of thought, of emotion, of presence. His body became a site of transformation, not just a weapon, but an instrument through which the deepest truths of his being could be expressed. This was no longer about victory, fame, or even legacy. The outer achievements were byproducts of something more elemental, the reuniting of the fragmented self. In each confrontation, whether in combat, in public, or in solitude, he was meeting a part of himself that had to be acknowledged, reconciled, and integrated. The warrior's path was not one of domination, but of unification. The lifelong labor of bringing into alignment all the disparate energies within the psyche so that action and being, movement and meaning could finally become one.